What's up, kids? This is chapter 12 of Norman Levine's Norman Levine's The Tragic Deception, Marx contra Engels. This is chapter 12. It's titled Scientific Socialism as German Ethnocentrism. Let's go. Engels' unilinear view of history also shaped his attitude towards imperialism. Living in 1895, Engels experienced the first stage of Europe's great expansion overseas. His attitude toward the non-Western world was one of cultural superiority. Technologically and economically, Western Europe was the most advanced portion of the globe. It was further advanced along the necessitarian line of development, feudalism, capitalism, communism, than any other area of the world. Engels was guilty of European ethnocentrism. He was tainted by European, more particularly German nationalism, and this sense of cultural superiority was buttressed and confirmed by his unilinear view of history. Like Marx, Engels was aware that imperialism was bringing about a social revolution in Asia. Western imperialism, because it was supported by superior technology, because it was supported by a higher economic formation like capitalism, was breaking down traditional and outmoded socioeconomic formations in the non-Western world. Engels, but not Marx, felt that Western imperialism was a revolutionary force because Western imperialism represented a higher and more advanced stage of eco-technological development. It's probably more eco, like economic, not eco as in green. Engels, but not Marx, believed that Asia, after the revolution caused by capitalist imperialism, must imitate the path of Western evolution. Like Marx, Engels is aware of a unique mode of Asiatic production. The central feature of the Asiatic mode of production, Engels wrote to Marx in 1853, was the, quote, absence of property in land is indeed the key to the whole of the East, end quote. Engels attributed the lack of private property in the Orient to climatic conditions and the nature of the soil. The desert that stretched from the Sahara across Arabia and Persia to India required artificial irrigation if agriculture was to be undertaken. Engels indicated that construction and maintenance of an irrigation system was, quote, a matter of either for the communes, the provinces, or the central government, end quote. For more on this, these like so-called like hydraulic modes of production or hydraulic societies, check out the piece. It's actually uploaded today, which this is probably going to be uploaded way later. But there's a piece on the channel by a guy named Richard Pete. That's an introduction to Karl Wittfogel, who wrote a lot about Asiatic mode of production and hydraulic-based societies that required a large degree of centralization in order to irrigate, to provide water for agricultural development. Whereas societies that did not necessitate that were more decentralized. Engels was thus in basic agreement with Marx on the nature and characteristics of the Asiatic mode of production, communal ownership of land, despotic government, control of the irrigation system by the despotic government. Nevertheless, Engels both consistently and adamantly affirmed the superiority of Western society. It was both higher and better than non-Western society. Marx never made a value judgment as to the relationship between Western and non-Western societies. Engels did and penned the following words on this matter. Quote, the struggle of the Bedouins was a hopeless one, and though the manner in which brutal soldiers like Begal, Bugeaud, have carried on the war is highly blamable, the conquest of Algeria is an important and fortunate fact for the progress of civilization. And after all, the modern bourgeois, with civilization, industry, and at least relative enlightenment following him, is preferable to the feudal lord or the marauding robber with the barbarian state of society to which they belong. Let me take a picture of that real quick. Sorry, I know this is annoying. Sorry about that. Furthermore, Engels was strongly opposed to any romanticization of underdeveloped or primitive peoples. While he overestimated the revolutionary potential of the proletariat, he urged that European socialists not glorify and idealize people in peasant societies. On August 9, 1882, Engels wrote to Bernstein that Western European socialists should be very guarded in their appraisal of Oriental revolutions, quote, and yet no sooner does a riot break out somewhere than the entire romance revolutionary world is uncritically in raptures over it, end quote, Engels. Engels preferred a more realistic and tough-minded understanding that peasants were slow to change and readily accepted autocracy in whatever form. In fact, by his constant juxtaposition of the word, quote, civilized with Western Europe and the word, quote, barbarian with Asian and non-capitalistic world, Engels made Western society synonymous with civilization. Conversely, Engels made Oriental society synonymous with primitive or backward retrograde societies. Engels' ingrained sense of Western superiority was manifested still further in his military writing on Asia. As we have seen in terms of European events, Engels tended to specialize in military matters, leaving the commentary on politics and economics to Marx. The same division of labor, military versus political, was adhered to in relation to contemporary events in Asia. Engels simply assumed that in regular battle, Asian armies were no match for armies led and equipped by Europeans. The tactics and strategy, the discipline and organization, the military technology of the Europeans were simply superior to regular Asian armies. In writing on the Sepoy Mutiny, Engels commented that, quote, the vast superiority of the English troops for such operations gave them every advantage, end quote. Not only were regular English troops inherently better than regular Asian troops, but because of their better schooling, English troops had a better grasp of science and therefore scientific warfare. Asians, because of their weak grasp of science, would require a long time before they could master scientific warfare. Quote, this requires a long time and is sure to meet with the most obstinate opposition from Oriental ignorance, impatience, prejudice, and vicissitudes of fortune and favor inherent to Eastern courts, end quote. Furthermore, the English troops were better organized, accepted the leadership of their officers. The Asians fought as clans rather than having any sense of national cohesiveness. Engels asserted that the intelligence, heroism, and cooperativeness of the regular European army were superior and therefore must prove victorious over the Asian. In fact, Engels' general attitude toward the Asian was disparaging and condescending. Scientific warfare in regular battles was invincible, and Engels had come to associate scientific technology with Western civilization. This is not to say that Engels was not acquainted with guerrilla warfare. Engels recognized how the Sepoy Mutiny changed after the defeats of the Indian regular armies into guerrilla warfare. Engels saw how the Chinese people during the Second Opium War had moved toward guerrilla warfare. Above all, Engels was aware that regular European military strategy was either impotent or seriously challenged by guerrilla activities. But Engels did not feel that guerrilla warfare could lead to the military exhaustion and total political defeat of European forces in Asia. Although Engels favored liberation of the underdeveloped world from Europe, he nowhere indicates that guerrilla warfare would be the chief military means to that end. Engels was, of course, in favor of Asian national liberation movements. On September 12, 1882, Engels wrote to Kautsky that, quote, ... in my opinion, the colonies proper, i.e. the countries occupied by a European population, Canada, the Cape, Australia, will become independent. On the other hand, the countries inhabited by a native population, which are simply subjugated, must be taken over for the time being by the proletariat and led as rapidly as possible towards independence. End quote. It's interesting to note that Engels did not select the peasantry as the class that would achieve national liberation for the colonies. Rather, as in the case of Europe, the proletariat as the only true revolutionary class must lead the movement toward independence. Indeed, then, Asia must pass through capitalism because capitalism was the only form of society that had produced a proletariat from within itself. Like Marx, Engels was aware that Western imperialism was revolutionizing China. In 1857, Engels wrote that, quote, before many years pass away, we shall have to witness the death struggle of the oldest empire in the world and the opening day of a new era for all Asia. The Asiatic mode of production was not only disappearing in China, but it was also being replaced by capitalism. In his letters to Danielson, Engels noted how big industry and railroads were beginning to make inroads in Chinese society. Engels assumed that wherever modern industry penetrated, capitalism would follow in its wake. Thus, China, because it was industrializing, would be capitalized. Engels expressed similar views to Kautsky when he said that, quote, the capitalist mode of production only remains to conquer China, end quote. Thus, according to Engels, China must pass from feudalism to capitalism and then to communism. It must also follow the same path of evolution as the West. Engels was tainted by the sense of cultural dominance that the great age of European imperialism bred throughout Europe. Engels accepted this superiority. Europe had a world mission. The salvation of the world was in the hands of Europe. Engels' sense of superiority was cultural rather than racist. He used economic determinism to substantiate his cultural elitism. Engels' cultural ethnocentrism was demonstrated most clearly in his attitude toward the South Slavs. When Engels talked of the South Slavs, he meant the Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenes, Croats, Serbians, Ukrainians, Romanians, and Bulgars. From 1848 until his death, he did not think these various nationalities were ready for national independence. In fact, Engels talked in terms of the unique cultural mission of the Germans had to these lesser nationalities. The same kind of cultural ethnocentrism or cultural elitism that Engels manifested toward the Asians, he manifested both greater articulateness toward the South Slavs. However, in the case of the South Slavs, Engels' cultural nationalism was narrower. That is, it was centered on Germany. It was Germany in particular, not Western society in general, which carried the mission to civilize these people of a lower societal order. Engels was no stranger to nationalism. Engels was an ardent German nationalist. In the cases of Ireland, Poland, Italy, Engels supported the nationality movements. Engels' condescending attitude toward the Slavs had nothing to do with proletarian internationalism, but was rather a case in which he thought the South Slavs were unfit for national independence. That is, he thought them incapable of building and preserving states. Only the great nations of Europe, those nations that were highly civilized, like the French, English, Italians, Germans, and Poles, had proven themselves historically capable of founding states. Engels spoke in extraordinarily disparaging terms about the South Slavs. He referred to them as Geschichtlosen, historyless. Quote, Rübergesindel, a pack of thieves, Zwergstämme, dwarf peoples, and Trümmerstücke, pieces of wreckage. Engels sought to dissociate himself from the liberal and radical attitude toward the South Slavs. The liberals and radicals expressed great sympathy for the, quote, suppressed nationalities, end quote, but Engels himself had no such sympathies. Furthermore, Engels did not want to romanticize the South Slavs. Dreamers and idealists could sympathize and glorify these, quote, natural people, end quote, but Engels judged, and he advised Bernstein and Babel to judge also, on the basis of brutal realism. Scientific socialism showed these, quote, dwarf nations, this, quote, pack of thieves, to be historically unprepared to achieve national independence. Excuse me. For instance, in 1882, Engels maintained that a greater Serbia was still, quote, 2 to 4 generations, end quote, from being realized. In 1882, the elements that would be needed to create a greater Serbia were still not in existence. In 1886, Engels said the same thing about the Bulgars. In the case of the Bulgars, however, it would take them, quote, 60 years of bourgeois development, end quote, before they were ready to achieve national independence. Engels felt the same way about the other, quote, historyless, end quote, people in the Balkans. Regardless of their quaint customs, regardless of their primitive appeal, regardless of their reputed purity, the South Slavs were not ready to attain political sovereignty. European national liberation movements, according to Engels, should be supported as long as they were at the same time socially progressive. German unification was acceptable and was necessary because German unification helped to bring about the ascendancy of the bourgeoisie. Polish liberation was acceptable because a free Poland would act as a buffer against Tsarist aristocratic expressionism. Chinese independence should be supported because Chinese independence would shrink the European mastery of the world market and thus hasten the collapse of European capitalism. Irish independence was needed because it would help destroy the British Empire. The case of the South Slavs was different, however, because these national liberation movements were not socially progressive. Engels desperately feared their pan-Slavist tendencies. Pan-Slavism, in Engels' eyes, was the most reactionary force in Europe. It was simply a tool and instrument of Tsarist imperialism. For these South Slavs people to win their independence as satellites of Tsarist expansionism would allow reactionary Russia to move to the heart of Central Europe. Such an extension of Tsarist influence would be a major setback for the revolutionary forces of Western Europe. It was better then for these, quote, suppressed nationalities, end quote, even if they were ready for independence, not to achieve independence. It was better for these, quote, suppressed nationalities, end quote, to remain suppressed, because then the doorway to Central Europe and Constantinople will be barred to Tsarism. From this perspective, Engels was an Austrophile. If the South Slavs must remain suppressed, it was best that they remain colonized within an Austro-Hungarian empire. Austro-Hungary then had a twofold purpose in the Balkans. By dominating the Slavs, it was a dam against Russian expansion in the Balkans. Secondly, in relation to Austro-Hungary, Engels believed that, quote, one could speak of it as having a certain cultural international mission, end quote. That is, the Germans had a cultural mission to perform in the Balkans. It was their duty to raise the Slavs to a higher level of civilization, to prepare them for eventual liberation. One second, let me get a drink. The liberation of the South Slav would come in either of two ways. First, if Russia had a revolution in Russia would not only rid Russia of Tsardom, but also of Pan-Slavism. With the threat of Tsarist Pan-Slavism removed, the, quote, suppressed nationalities, end quote, in the Balkans could achieve independence. A revolutionized Russia would mean that nationalities in the Balkans would again unite with social progressivism. Second, if the proletariat came to power in the West, the, quote, suppressed nationalities, end quote, of the Balkans would be allied with a progressive proletarian revolution in the West, and therefore South Slav independence would also carry with it a socially reformist program. Once more, however, in Engels' opinion, it was the proletariat who must lead, who were the only carriers of revolution. A proletarian revolution in Russia or the West was a necessary precondition for South Slav independence. Allied to Engels' notion of the mission of the proletariat was Engels' notion of the mission of German culture. A part of the advanced culture of the West, German civilization had a salvationist purpose, to prepare the Slav for statism. In short, the German proletariat was the hope of civilization. German culture must civilize the Slavs, but the German proletariat must lead them to independence. Engels had not only identified Germany as having a messianic purpose, but in particular it was the German Socialist Party that specifically carried the messianic goal of communism. The unilinear view of history had imparted to the German proletariat a global salvationist function. Engels' identification of the German proletariat with the fate of the global socialist revolution received greater confirmation when he turned to the problems of war and peace at the end of the 19th century. The identification of the worldwide proletarian revolution with German socialism was hardened when Engels pondered the relationship between Germany and Russia in the European balance of power. Engels' view of Russia contained two levels. First, there was Russia as a social entity, the Russia to which capitalism was coming, the Russia that was pregnant with social revolution. Second, there was the diplomatic Russia, the Russia that was under the actual guidance of the Tsar, the present Russia that intervened in the affairs of Europe in terms of her imperial conservatism. When Engels talked to the messianic mission of the German proletariat, he did so in relation to the second Russia, the present Russia of imperial conservatism. The Franco-Prussian War, according to Engels, was one of the decisive turning points of the 19th century. Because of the German acquisition of Alsace and Lorraine, Engels, like Marx, believed that Russia had become the arbiter of Europe. France would desire the return of the lost provinces and would seek an alliance with Russia in her next war with Germany, and thus Russia held the European balance of power. Bismarck, wishing to conserve the aristocratic structure of Imperial Germany, also needed the support of reactionary Russia. The social structure of a Prussianized Germany would be consolidated through an alliance with an inherently conservative Tsardom. Thus, the German aristocracy needed the social alliance of the Russian aristocracy, and in this manner also Russia was the arbiter of Europe. In fact, Russia was the bulwark of the conservative order in Europe. Furthermore, the defeat of France and the subsequent defeat of the Paris Commune fundamentally shifted the center of gravity of the European workers' movement. Germany had become the center. In the pre-unification days, Engels could call for a war against Russia as a means of unifying Germany. In the post-unification period after Germany had become the leader of the European proletarian movement, Engels thought not of war but of peace as a means of preserving the German socialist movement. Peace was the policy Engels advocated after 1871. Peace would allow the industrialization and thus the capitalization of the remainder of Europe to proceed in an uninterrupted fashion. The further industrialization of Germany and Russia would inevitably occasion the proletarian revolution. When Engels related to Russia on the first level, on the level of socio-economic development, he was of the opinion that the maintenance of peace would enhance the possibilities of the Russian revolutionary movements coming to power. On September 29, 1891, he wrote to Bebel that, quote, internal contradictions must of necessity dissolve Russia, end quote. War, however, would check and delay this necessity. War would unleash the emotions of nationalism and chauvinism, and this would only repress the workers' movement in Russia. Quote, the entire work of the revolutionaries in Russia, which stands for the dawning of victory, would be needlessly destroyed, end quote, by war. Engels wrote to Bebel on an earlier occasion after 1871. Engels was committed to the idea that war was a tool of the reactionaries. Similarly, peace was the ally of revolution in Germany. Another date of major significance in the history of 19th century Europe, according to Engels, was 1890. In February of that year, the German Social Democratic Party won their largest electoral victory. Engels was ecstatic, and on the 7th of March, 1890, wrote to Paul Lafargue, quote, February 20th is the date of the beginning of the revolution in Germany. That is why we must not let ourselves be smashed up before our time, ... That is why we must come out for the time being for legal action and not react to the provocation which will be lavished upon us. For short of a bloodletting, and pretty severe one at that, Bismarck and Wilhelm are doomed, end quote. In the above paragraph, Engels made two equally vital statements. First, he affirmed his dedication to a non-revolutionary proletarian policy. The forces of history were on the side of the proletariat, and thus peace would also allow these forces to come to fruition. This statement, coupled with Engels' remarks in his introduction of 1895 to Marx's class struggles in France, in which he surrendered the idea of urban insurrection and violence, marked Engels as one of the chief spokesmen for the socialist policy of social peace. In effect, Engels surrendered the instrument of violence as a revolutionary instrument. Engels, in effect, surrendered the idea of irreconcilable class warfare as a revolutionary instrument. In short, even though Engels philosophically and theoretically denied it, he in actuality had given up the idea of proletarian revolution, had given up the essence of the concept of class warfare, and espoused a policy of non-revolutionary evolutionism and gradualism. Second, Engels affirmed his dedication to the idea of the inevitability of the socialist revolution. For Engels, quote, Bismarck and Wilhelm are doomed, end quote. Nothing could save them. The laws of history had decreed their demise. Engels' commitment to the inevitability of the proletarian revolution was further evidenced by a letter sent to Bebel on October 24, 1891. In that letter he wrote, quote, in the report you, Bebel, indicated that I affirmed that the collapse of bourgeois society would occur in 1898. That is a small error. I've only said that there exists the possibility that we can come to power in 1898. The old bourgeois society can, in case this does not happen, still vegetate for some time, so long as an external attack does not crack the decadent exterior. So foul an old corpse can be preserved for 2 more decades if the surroundings remain calm, end quote. Engels assumed that the German socialists would come to power by 1898. If not, then bourgeois society would not last any longer than 20 more years. Furthermore, Engels' inevitabilism directly strengthened Engels' policy of social peace. If the revolution were sure to come, there's no reason to pursue a policy of irreconcilable class struggle and violence. On the other hand, war would strengthen the reactionary forces both in Russia and in Germany. In the Germany of Wilhelm II, war would be a serious setback for the socialist movement. On September 13, 1886, Engels wrote to Bebel that, quote, war would be a setback for our movement throughout Europe. In many lands it would be totally destroyed, chauvinism and national hate would be unleashed, end quote. In Germany itself, the movement would revive after the war, but there was no guarantee that conditions would be as favorable for its growth as they were now. In the diplomatic Russia of the Tsar, war was an instrument of conservative expansionism. The chief ideological expression of Tsarist imperialism was pan-Slavism. The chief reason for the Russian autocrat to expand was to forestall social revolution at home. Germany thus displayed an ambivalent attitude toward Russia. On the one hand, Germany needed Tsarist Russia as a support for the essentially aristocratic nature of Germany's social structure. On the other hand, Russia's expansionism under the aegis of Pan-Slavism was a mortal enemy to Germany. A victory for Pan-Slavism in Central Europe, Engels wrote to Kautsky, would virtually end the revolutionary movement in Germany. If Germany unstintingly supported existent Tsarist diplomatic ambitions, she ran the risk of being engulfed under the Pan-Slavic horde. If Germany resisted Russia, she ran the risk of unleashing social revolution in Russia, not only a disaster for Russia, but a serious threat to conservative Germany as well. The ambivalence of Germany's attitude toward Russia was acutely expressed by Engels in a letter to Paul Lafargue. Quote, "This is the situation. To avoid a revolution in Russia, the Tsar must have Constantinople. Bismarck hesitates. Bismarck would like to find a way of avoiding either contingency." End quote. Engels. Engels had a good grasp of the balance of social and diplomatic forces in Europe to the end of the century. He understood that the conservative order in Europe rested upon the continuation of Tsardom. He also understood that the fall of Tsardom to a social revolution would mean the end of the conservative order in Europe generally, and the spreading of the social revolution in Europe. However, in Engels' eyes, peace would inevitably bring the social revolution to Russia. War would only strengthen Tsarism because of its concomitant chauvinism. Engels failed to see that war could be a revolutionary device. He failed to see that a Tsarist defeat in a war could unleash the social revolution in Russia. Engels was caught in a tactical box. By not seeing the revolutionary implications of war, Engels could only turn back to the ballot box, to parliamentarism. As we have seen, the year 1890 was a crucial one for Engels. It was a high watermark in the growth of a German socialist movement. It was crucial also because in 1890, Germany ended its Russian connection. What Engels had feared when he wrote about the consequences of annexation of Alsace-Lorraine had come to pass. France and Russia would be allies. Engels' diplomatic speculations changed after 1890. Germany now was confronted with a two-front war, a war in which Germany would face on its eastern front the armies of Pan-Slavic Tsarism. Essentially, Engels still favored a policy of peace, but if war did come, Germany must fight an all-out war against Russia. The German socialists must support this war. The German socialists must, quote, "demand the universal arming of the people," end quote. They also must see that the war be carried on against Russia with all, quote, "revolutionary means," end quote. Engels was more specific in a letter he wrote to Babel on October 24th, 1891. We German socialists who, if peace were to be maintained, would come to power in 10 years, have the duty to preserve our unconquered position as the avant-garde of the workers' movement, not only against internal enemies, but also against external opponents. If Russia wins, we are suppressed. If Russia begins the war, we must attack not only Russia, but Russia's allies, no matter who they are. We must be concerned to carry out this war with every revolutionary means. We have not forget the glorious example of the French of 1793, and we are pressed. We can show that we will celebrate the Unilinear Jubilee of 1793, in which we will demonstrate that the German workers of 1893 are not unworthy of the sans-culottes of 100 years ago. End quote, Engels. Sorry, I have to take a picture of this as well. Sorry about that. That's annoying. What Engels did was to identify the fate of the German Social Democratic Party with the European and therefore the world revolution. At the end of his life, Engels called upon the German socialists to support imperial spending for armaments and national defense. Engels asked the German proletariat to enter the imperial army in order to directly defend the feudal conservative order of Germany, on the assumption that the proletariat would also be indirectly defending German socialism. There had taken place in Engels' mind a fusion between his German nationalism and the messianic mission of the German proletariat. A victory for Germany in terms of Engels' own logic was a concomitant victory for the world socialist revolution. Thus, Engels laid the basis for the policy of the German Social Democratic Party and the entire Second International in the crisis of 1914. By not opposing war at all costs, by not thinking of war as a revolutionary tool, Engels encouraged the Second International to think in terms of a policy of national defensism. Engels' own nationalism proved to be endemic. It spread to the socialist movements in other European countries. Engels believed that the laws by which society evolved were as firm, as unalterable, as necessitarian as the laws of the physical universe. Essentially, society evolved in accordance with the laws of economic determinism. That is, the laws of technological innovation finally determining. That is, the laws of technological determinism. The laws of technological innovation finally determined the general line of historical growth. Propelled by technological advances, society had moved from primitive communism to feudalism to capitalism. It would next move to communism. Western civilization was the first area of the globe to have passed through the stages from primitive communism to capitalism. Because the West had advanced already to this state, the technological forces of society would make it the first portion of the globe to move upward to communism. Asia and all other areas of the globe must also follow this four-stage pattern of growth. Global history was a unilinear process for Engels. Europe had reached the highest stage. Asia must imitate Europe. The communist revolution must first break out in Europe. Western civilization led the world. The proletarian party in Germany led Western civilization. Therefore, the German proletariat led the world. Engels' view of history supported his German nationalism. His conception that the laws of economic growth necessitated societies passing through fixed stages, his conception that Europe stood at the stage just below communism prepared him to see the German proletarian party as the messianic party of the world communist revolution. Engels' view of history meant that inevitabilism replaced consciousness. Because Engels was so certain that the communist revolution would come to Germany within 2 decades, it was enough for the German socialists to wait. Vulgar Marxism replaced vital creative Marxism. Social determinism replaced consciousness. That's the end of the chapter, and now it's time for the footnotes. One of these letters is from Engels to Marx, June 6, 1853. Karl Marx can be found in Karl Marx and Colonialism and Modernization, edited by Shlomo Avineri. Friedrich Engels, French Rule in Algeria. Engels to Bernstein, August 9, 1882. Karl Marx and Colonialism and Modernization. Engels, military aftermath of the capture of Lucknow, which is in Karl Marx on Colonialism and Modernization. Engels, Persia, China, also in Karl Marx on Colonialism and Modernization. It references the Roman Rozdolsky piece that criticizes Engels' anti-Slavism, or what's it called? Historyless peoples, or whatever. Roman Rozdolsky, it's translated into English somewhere. I think the person who translated is this Ukrainian socialist guy. It's like John Paul Hilmka, or Paul John Hilmka, something like that. He's involved in the American Ukrainian community, but from a left, the Canadian the Canadian Ukrainian community, but it's from a left-wing perspective as opposed to a reactionary nationalist perspective. He's involved in Ukrainian politics, but he translated the piece by Roman Rozdolsky, which here in German is titled Friedrich Engels und das Problem der Geschichte Losen Volker, or Felker. I think that translates to Friedrich Engels and the problem of historyless people. It might be peoples, maybe plural. Engels Lafargue correspondence. Yeah, that's basically it. Thanks for listening.